Hi, folks. Welcome back. And if you're just tuning in, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the 2021 Virtual Rower and Jerome Pilgrimage. My name is Erin Aoyama, and I am so delighted to introduce our next presenter, Heather Register Zbinden. Heather is the outreach coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art at the Central Arkansas Library System. She holds bachelor degrees in English and History and a master's degree in Public History from the University of Arkansas Little Rock. Heather has worked in public history for over 20 years and has contributed to projects at the Old State House Museum, the Central High School National Historic Site, the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, and Life Interrupted, the Japanese American Experience in World War II Arkansas. She's a former board member of the Arkansas Women's History Institute, the Arkansas Museums Association, Central High School Museum, Inc., and the Pulaski County Historical Association. So Heather is here today to talk about a really incredible collection. Hi, Heather.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much, Erin. So I'm coming to you live from McGee, Arkansas, just a few miles from Rower. I drove down this morning from Little Rock, which is, for those of you who haven't been to Arkansas, I'm about 2 hours south of the Central Arkansas Library System in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I am in the home of Rosalie Gould, and we're going to talk with Rosalie here in a minute. But I wanted to start with a presentation a little bit about the collection that she has donated to the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. Just a little bit of background. I started working with this collection about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago. I met Rosalie then and started working with the collection that she had amassed and had been given by Jamie Vogel. And that was part of the Life Interrupted project. So it was one of the first history projects that I did right out of graduate school. And so for the past 20 years, on and off, I've worked with this collection. So let's get started. So normally when I talk to folks, I tell them I do a lot of history of Japanese American incarceration. And I use this map, which just yesterday I realized they've spelled Rower wrong. This is a National Park Service map, so I'm going to have to get a different map. But as you can see, these are the 10 camps. And the ones here in Arkansas are in the southeast corner of the state. Little Rock is in the geographic center of Arkansas. And so we're about an hour and a half to 2 hours south, about 45 minutes north of the Louisiana border. And this area along the Mississippi River, both in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, is some of the poorest in the nation today as it was in the 1940s. And so that kind of gives you an idea of where we are. Okay. So the collection that we're going to talk about today is the Gould Vogel collection. We have a number of pieces, both art and the textual documents, the archival materials that were amassed by Jamie Vogel and then Rosalie Gould. And so these two pastels here, as well as others that you'll see here in just a minute, are really extraordinary works of art. These are from high school students, and they just show so much depth of artistic skill. Throughout the presentation, I'm also going to talk or read quotes from inmates who were in the camps, mainly at Rower. They wrote autobiographies for their English teacher when they first arrived in 1942. And so Mary Kobayashi says, quote, "I could still clearly remember the sunny December afternoon when I heard Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, had been attacked. Right there and then, the world seemed to crumble under my feet. My first thought was, what will the people think or feel towards us at school tomorrow? All day long, I moped around the house with a face longer than a horse's. But the incident that knocked the wind out of me was when the man my father was working for was taken by the FBI because they said he was an enemy alien and was very dangerous to this country." And so we have a number of these pastel portraits, just exquisite in their technique and their stroke work and their color use. Kamatsu Sugimoto said, quote, "On May 4th, 1942, we moved to the farm by Stockton. We stayed there temporarily until evacuation. Our asparagus farm was taken over by the Caucasians. On May 21st, we were evacuated to the Stockton Assembly Center. I worked as a yard laborer for 4 months. My wage was only $8 per month. On October 3rd, we were sent to the Rower Relocation Center." And then also pencil drawings, lots of portrait pencil drawings. June Yamanaka says, quote, "Every week we get letters from our American friends at home who write to us telling us that they miss us and hope that the war will end soon so we can go back to the old ways of things. I too am hoping for the same things." The collection also includes landscapes in watercolor and pencil, showing life in the world around them. I'm particularly fond of the pencil drawing on the right. Driving through the Arkansas Delta at times, the only sign of modern life are the telephone poles. And it was true then as it is now. And actually, when I was driving down this morning, there are now cell phone towers and solar arrays to add to the modern signs of life. But still, there are points on the drive where you look out and it is just fields with a few telephone poles. Takeo Sabata said, quote, "When I first sat down to eat at a long wooden table with thousands of other evacuees at the Assembly Center in Arcadia, California, I saw some people with tears in their eyes as they started to eat the poor meal out of metal plates. I guess they all felt like I did, for they hardly touched their plates and kept their heads bent down. This was the first meal. Later, they seemed to get used to the eating with thousands of other people, for they started to talk to friends across the table and beside them." The piece here on the right is, I'm assuming it's on the right on your screen. It's the smaller of the two pieces, and it's actually on a piece of like leather hide. And to me, this painting, this watercolor really depicts the Delta. I mean, obviously it shows the barracks of camp, but that tree line and then just sky for days. That's really what the Delta looks like. But there are trees. Not as many as there once were, but there are trees. The artists in the camp used what was available to them. Here is an acrylic painting on denim. Because these camps were essentially military installations, Army and Navy surplus was available, such as bolts of denim fabric and Navy peacoats. And acrylic is, not a real good permanent medium like oil would be. And so the fact that these acrylics that were painted on fabric, on denim fabric, have survived as well as they have is really, it's remarkable. And there's 3D art. That's 3D art. So the bracelet with the J on it, and the little piece that kind of sits there with the star on it, all metal punch. Again, using probably metal cans from the mess hall. And probably one of my favorite pieces in the collection is this necklace of black beads on a kind of pink purple piece of thread. It's actually embroidery thread, like many layers of embroidery floss for anybody out there that's an embroiderer. And then wooden sandals. Another one of my favorite pieces is this pin of the three monkeys, hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. And on the back is carved the initials AGK, and it says Aurora Arkansas 1944. And then the birds, dozens of bird pins in our collection. I've always picked these three though, because they are birds we still see in Arkansas. So you've got the cardinal. I'm guessing that's a wren or a finch. I'm not sure entirely. I'm not a great bird person. And then the duck. And then there's the great irony of the posters to sell war bonds. So like I said, in addition to the art that we have in the collection, we also have lots of archival materials. So these are two examples of the front pages of the autobiographies that I've been reading from. And so the English teachers asked them to write an essay so that they could get to know them. And they give all kinds of information about the students. They show a mix of patriotism, confusion about relocation, longing for home, and hope for the future. One of the essays says, quote, "School has started, but right now it isn't like the schools I'm used to in California. The school in California had nice, comfortable desks, all kinds of shops, but print shop was my favorite shop. It also had good assemblies and all kinds of sports to see. Well, those days are memories now. Rower is permanent and school has started. Right now, its buildings don't look like school buildings yet, but in due time, I think we'll see some changes made. I'm looking forward to that time. Right now, I have American literature, and I will try to pass with at least a grade better than C." And then in addition to the autobiographies, we have a number of archival materials such as the Rower Outpost newspapers, both in English and Japanese. And then the Little Daniel comic strip was done by one of the inmates in camp, and they did a whole book called 1 Year in a Relocation Center. So an important part of this story, I feel, is how we have this collection. So many collections of art from the camps didn't survive if there was art. And so we really owe it to two remarkable women. This is Mabel Rose Jamison Vogel. She was known as Jamie. She was born in Texas in 1905 and graduated from Arkansas State Teachers College in Conway. She accepted a teaching position at Rower and taught art at the camp. Once the camps closed, she corresponded with many of her students and encouraged them to continue their art. The collections she amassed was one of her most prized possessions. And then there's this lady. This is Rosalie Santine Gould. Born in Tiller, Rosalie's grandparents came to the United States from Italy to work at the Sunnyside Plantation. After the war, Rosalie married Joe Gould and moved to Rower, Arkansas. She took her children to play around the monuments left by the inmates, but didn't really know anything about the camps. As former inmates started to return and visit the site, they found Rosalie. She met Jamie, and when Jamie died in 1994, she left her Rower art collection to Rosalie. Together with others, like Sam Yatta, Rosalie worked to save the monuments at Rower and have the location made a National Historic Landmark. So this is Rower today, I guess within the past couple of years. Little is physically left of the camps at Rower and Jerome. In the past 20 years, the monuments at Rower have been stabilized and preserved through a National Park Service confinement site grant and with the help of the UA Little Rock's Public History Program. The School of Architecture at UA Fayetteville has created a website with recreations of the Rower Relocation Center. Arkansas State University's Heritage Studies program has added signage and interpretive panels for visitors. And the city of McGee has restored its railroad depot and created the Japanese-American World War II Internment Camp Museum. So now I'm going to end with a quote from Jim Tanaka, one of the many students who wrote an autobiography for his English teacher upon arrival at Rower in 1942. Quote, like thousands of American citizens of Japanese ancestry that were interned in various relocation camps throughout the Great West, quote, due to necessary measures of war, end quote. My future is as yet quite uncertain and unpredictable. But of this, I am sure. The powers of terrorism and request of peaceful countries must be rushed and peace and rights of free people restored once more. All of us, young and old, are making many bitter sacrifices. But I think we shall have to make more and more to end this greatest war in the history of mankind. I look forward to the future when all this shall be but a memory, and I can live in the most powerful and democratic nation in the world, champion of peaceful, freedom-loving people, regardless of race, color, or creed. So real quick, I added this. We've published 2 books. The Butler Center for Arkansas Studies has published 2 books about our collection. A Captive Audience focuses on the art, but really focuses on the autobiographies, and it's available through your local bookseller or Amazon. And then The Art of Living is the catalog of the collection. We created this using the last confinement site grant that we received. We cannot sell these books because we used grant money. So if you email me, I will send you a copy. I have about 135 left. So I can send you a copy of this book. It's really an incredible collection of the art. And so for more information, you can go to robertslibrary.org/rower, and that will get you to our collection. So that ends my presentation.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was wonderful. And it was really great to see some of those pieces from the collection and hear about some of your favorites. I know you have a special guest.
Yes, we're doing a little non-technical.
I love it. Hi, Rosalie.
Hello.
Thank you so much, both of you, for being with us and for, this collection and its existence and being willing to answer some questions, talk more about its history. So folks who are watching along, please leave any questions, comments, things in the chat, and I will direct them to Heather and Rosalie. But I guess to get us started, one question I have kind of for both of you, so either or both of you can answer this, is to talk a little bit about the uniqueness of Rower and Jerome within sort of the history of Japanese American incarceration. These 2 sites are different from the other 8 sites. All of the 10 camps are quite unique in their own ways, but there's something about, these 2 camps being in the Delta in Arkansas, as you sort of started your presentation with, Heather. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the history of Arkansas shapes the way that you tell these stories and that you talk about this collection. I'll leave it there.
We were just talking about the popularity of the Rower camp, and I've often wondered just why everyone wants to come to Rower. Of course, it's to see me. Of course,
of course.
That goes without saying. But no, really, if you are not a accustomed, or if you know nothing at all about this area, it's strange. We live in what's called the Delta. We are on the west side of the Mississippi River. And as Heather told you, it's a very, very poor country. And the people, I imagine it's just a way of life and it'll never change. I don't know why, whether it's the mindset of the people or whether it's just meant to be, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. But as Heather told you, I had married in 1949 and had moved to Roar, but no one literally ever talked about the camps. And I knew nothing about it because I was at the University of Arkansas during the entire war, and of course, everyone knew there was some Japanese in the area, but we were never told exactly who they were or why they were there. And later I found out that the Japanese Americans were never told why they were there or what the reason was. And I remember the first time I met some of the internees, they wouldn't look at you. They were having dinner the time I met them, and they were looking down at their plates. And as I was talking to the different ones, they wouldn't look up. There was no smile, no anything. And it just, I don't know, I guess it made me feel so sad to see these people who now this was 40 years after the camp closed. And I love cats, dogs, and animals, so I guess I just added Japanese Americans to the mix. And these last 37 years of how many there have been wonderful, and I have thoroughly enjoyed every one of the internees that I've ever met. And thank you for letting me say that.
I think that one of the things that makes Arkansas unusual, there's two things. There's the fact that these camps were in the South, and so there was the race line between black and white that was already dividing our culture. And when the Japanese Americans were here, honestly, people didn't know. I mean, the probably the best example is that the soldiers down at Camp Shelby, riding the bus up to visit family at Rower would, get on the bus and see that there was a colored section and a white section. And most of them would go immediately to the colored section towards the back of the bus. And the driver would tell them to come to the front of the bus. Richard Yada, who Richard's on here too. He said hi.
Oh, he's good.
So, Richard, I'll tell Richard's story. He said that as a child on the bus, he wanted to sit in the back of the bus to look out, right? Kids love the back of the bus to look out that back window. And the driver told him no, he has to sit at the front. So there is that issue. Also, because Arkansas has a very small Japanese American population, and were just, the governor had made it so that they could not stay after the war was over. The Yadas stayed, and a couple of other families of the Yadas have been here the longest, obviously. But that makes it unique too, that nobody stayed, and so there wasn't anybody to really tell the story.
And Heather, I want to come back to that, but I'm also wondering in the research that you've done, that both of you have done about the camps when they were in existence, what was the relationship like between incarcerated Japanese Americans and the surrounding communities? I know, Rosalie, you said that people didn't talk about this. There wasn't a sense of, understanding or thinking about why the Japanese were there, et cetera. But there had to have been some kind of, connections or relationship. So what was that like between the communities?
Oh, there was a lot of interaction. In fact, the internees were allowed out almost anytime they wanted to. They formed a Boy Scout troop, and they would go out to the Mississippi River and play and so forth. But as I said, the Japanese Americans were always encouraged to come back into McGee to do any of the shopping they wanted to, but it was more or less just an open open gate for the Japanese Americans. But I think the reason they didn't let the townspeople in was because they didn't know whether there would be, trouble or anything, because I'm sure some of the young men were fighting in the Pacific. But there was an awful lot of interaction with the adults and the children.
And the camp had electricity, whereas many areas didn't have electricity. So it was, in some ways, the life in the camp with the electricity was an upgrade to what life was like around. I mean, I'm not saying everyone no one in the Delta had electricity, but it was not as common.
And there was also the problem of the garbage. Some of the farmers who raised the hogs and so forth were allowed to go into the camp and pick up all of the leftovers, from the meals and so forth. And there was some argument about the fresh pieces of fresh fruit and all that was in the garbage that, of course, the people in town didn't have, because food was brought in to the camp.
I apologize. I keep muting myself because there's a very active fire truck outside my window. So
it's part of life right now, right?
Absolutely part of life, very much part of life. Thank you. That's so interesting to hear about. And I feel like you also hear stories about this question of food rationing and electricity, and what was fair between what was happening in the camps and in the communities nearby. Also the question of teachers and whether teachers were being paid more to work in these camps. And I know the WRA sort of responded and said, well, these teachers are making more money perhaps than in local school districts, but they're also working 12 months a year and in these really horrible conditions and all that. So lots of interesting conversations, I think, between the community and camp. I also think you hear about baseball. I remember reading some articles in both the local newspaper and in the Rower Outpost about baseball games or softball maybe, between the camp and the community. So lots of those interactions that are interesting, I think, lend an important shade to thinking about this history.
Well, see, you have to remember these were towns, and there were 10,000 people. In fact, Aurora was the fourth largest city in Arkansas during the war.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, and also I've lost it. Sorry.
Okay. Join the club.
That's okay. Maybe it'll come back. Yeah. So Rosalie, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that you've been able to meet so many, Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at Rower and Jerome, or who are descendants of folks who were incarcerated, that they call you, and, you've shown them around. And what was that like? Or what was the, first few visits from these folks like for you?
The first time I met them, a group of the internees had come from the St. Louis area to dedicate the fourth monument, which was dedicated to the young man who died from the young man of the 442nd who died in the European theater. And they asked me if I'd put on a dinner for the internees that night, and I said certainly. So that night, I prepared the dinner for them. Well, I didn't prepare it, but I had it prepared. And they came in, and as I was telling you, there were no smiles. There was nothing. They just sat there, and of course, I have to talk. So I was talking to everybody, and after the first two or three, they'd sit there and was just so solemn, and I would, I guess, like I do I would like to do to the birds, pet them when they're out here eating. And so, of course, they went ahead and had their dinner, and we were talking, and one of the ladies stood up and she said, that they were very disappointed in the site because the site had not been kept up. And I told them, well, I would be glad to. I was taken over as mayor of the city of McGee in a couple of months, and that I would, after hours, I would take my crew and go out there and clean it up at least once every week, and that I wanted them to know that my council would know that I'm taking them, but I'm taking them off hours. I would be paying them out of my pocket, use my equipment, and there would be no expense to the city for all. I mean, at all. And so this gentleman stood up and he said, Ms. Gould, he said, in my attic, I have 3 rolled up paintings that my father did of the camp. I would like for you to have it. And I said, well, I'd be glad to keep it in trust for you. And then someone else said, I have this. And someone said, I'd love to give you this. And I said, certainly, thank you. And I said, I'll tell you what. So I broke off some pieces of paper and I wrote my name and phone number. I said, if any of you decide to come back to visit or know of someone that will, let me know and I'll be glad to meet them, treat them to lunch and take them to the camp. Excuse me. So they said, well, fine, and took my name and we talked. And as they were leaving, I hugged of course, I'm a big hugger. So I hugged all of them and apologized for what we had done, put them in the camps. Well, about 3 or 4 weeks later, I got this phone call from this woman named Cheryl. And she said, Ms. Gould, I understand that you said that if anybody came back to visit Roar, that you would be glad to meet them, treat them to lunch, and take them to the camp. And I said, yes. She said, I have 3 busloads coming. Are you still interested? I said, oh, yes, ma'am, come on. So that started it. And I would have buses lined outside my house. And I had the best neighbors. They never complained about that. But it has just been wonderful. I have met thousands and thousands. Of course, I've spoken in quite a few places. And the internees have just absolutely, there's no describing it. As I have often said, once you meet the first one, you just can't wait to meet the rest of them.
Wow, and I want to know about the first time that you yourself went to the site at Rower. What was there? And did you know where you were when you went there for the first time?
You see, I moved out there when in 1949 when I married, and I was only about half a mile from the site. Mm-hmm. Rower is just a little community. It's not really a town. It's a farming community. And I would take my children out and they'd chase fireflies. And I'd sit there on that bench and I'd see the monuments, but never thought about it. And
you farmed the land around the cemetery.
Yes. In fact, the land belonged to my father-in-law and he sold it for the camp. And of course, my middle son was very upset about that when he found out about it. He said that his grandfather owned land that they put American citizens on. And he couldn't understand that his grandfather didn't know what the land was going for. But I imagine he would have sold it anyway because he loved to buy and sell land. So it would have been all the same to him.
And after the camps closed and most of the Japanese Americans left Arkansas, what happened with all of the barracks and buildings and infrastructure that was there? Are there any still around?
They had a big auction, and I mean, everything was sold. And it didn't take long. And a lot of the barracks were bought by people who did a little bit of remodeling and lived in those barracks after the Japanese Americans left.
Right.
Do you think this one is still out there, like before you get to the camp?
Yes, Gus Wilson.
Yes. Sorry.
No, that's great.
I mean, there's still quite a few of them. They have been remodeled a little bit, and you don't recognize
It's
them.
sided. It's got like vinyl siding on it, and
Yeah. Right. Well, you think of, there was also a housing shortage after the war as people are coming back. And I think that's kind of a common story around other camps as well. I know at Hart Mountain in Wyoming, there's barracks all over, still around Holy Lake.
But here it was so poor that they were so glad to get them,
Right.
Because they were living a lot of them were living in shacks to begin with. And these were a little bit better.
Right. Wow. Well, Rosalie, I'm sorry to be peppering you with questions, but since you're here, I'm wondering I know you were involved in a lot of preservation efforts, as you sort of talked about a little bit before, but of getting Rower to be designated a National Historic Site. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that process.
Oh, gosh, that's another story in itself. There was this man I met the night of the first night that I met the Japanese Americans. His name was George Sakaguchi, and George had retired from the Air Force. His parents had been interned in Rower, and he left the Rower camp to join the Air Force, and he moved to St. Louis. Well, George, when he found out that I was working with the camps, would come down. Now, George was worth quite a bit of money, but George was the tightest man I've ever known. Since he was a member of the Air Force, he would go to the St. Louis Airfield and talk them into flying him into Little Rock, and then I'd have to meet him in Little Rock and bring him over here, and then he'd use my car. He had some friends who lived in Vicksburg. Okay. I drive a BMW, and he loved it, but he wouldn't buy one now. He couldn't afford one. But George decided that we would have a 50th anniversary of the building of the camp. So he said, well, now I'll figure out what we need to do and let you know. And so he called me. I'm getting around to the designation. He said, he called and he's done a Rosalie, we've got to do this, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. Now I want you to do it this way, and I want you to do it this way, and I want you to do it this way. I said, George, what are you going to do? He said, somebody's got to plant it. So that was his. So then he decided we needed, Manzanar was designated historic site. So he said, we need to do the same thing. So he said, I'll get the forms and you fill them out and send them in. I said, okay. So we did. Well, he called not long after that and was just devastated. He said, they told us nobody cared about Roar. Nobody came here. They didn't know where it was and didn't care about it.
Wow.
And he said, what am I going to do? I said, nothing. Just wait. We'll talk about it. Well, I guess about 6 months later, he called and said, Rosalie, the Park Service is meeting in New Orleans. He said, I think we need to go down there and talk to them and tell them that everybody knows where Rower is. I said, well, George, I can't go. I've got this important meeting. You go. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He says, I'll fly into Little Rock. You meet me. And then he says, you loan me your car and I'll go down to New Orleans and talk to them. I said, okay. So he did. And coming back from after the meeting, he called, the phone rang and it was George. George said, they said, I talked to them. Knowing George, I could hear him talking. And he said, they had a session. And he said they talked about it and decided that maybe I was right. Maybe people did know where Roar was and would come. He said, now, I've been thinking about this. He said, you got a pencil? And I said, yes. He said, write this down. He said, I want you to prepare for a catfish dinner. I want you to do this. I want you to do this. I want you to do that. And sure enough, we got it done, and it was absolutely wonderful. I mean, we got the designation, and then, you know, had the big celebration for it and all, and it. But the funny thing was, uh, George was talking about everybody was flying into Little Rock, all the Japanese American former internees, and he said, "We've got to get the buses." There were 3 buses. We've got to get the buses from Little Rock to. No, this was the 50th anniversary. We've got to get the buses from Little Rock to Jerome, where we were going to dedicate this monument, and then back to Roar at noon. And he said, "Would you call and see if we can get a state police, escort?" Couldn't think of the name of it. I said, "Well, yes." I said, "I know Colonel Goodwin. I'll be glad to call him." So I called him and told him what we were having, and we needed an escort. And he said, "I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it." I said, "Well, thank you." So the day arrived, and I was out at the Roar site where they were getting ready for the catfish dinner and all. And in a few minutes, in comes the first bus, and the other 2 behind him. And the door opened, and George got out, and he came running over, and he hugged me. He said, "Rosalie, I didn't know you had this clout with the state police." And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I just called Colonel Goodwin." He said he'd have an escort. He said, when we got in the buses, he said there was a state trooper in front of us, and there was a state trooper behind the buses. He said, we started at the hotel, and he said, we got to the first intersection that was blocked off. We came through Little Rock. Everything was blocked off. Got to Pine Bluff. Everything was blocked off. Got down here in the really country going down to Jerome. He said, I never saw so many sheriff patrol. He said, I never told him. I didn't know Colonel Goodwin was going to do that. I just asked for one escort, and he thought I really had an in with the state police.
Well, you alluded to it, but I neglected to point out that Rosalie was the mayor of McGee for 12 years. And I don't know, have there been a lot of women mayors in Arkansas? Probably not.
No, there was only one there for the longest, and then
there was a petticoat government in Washington, Arkansas.
Yeah,
but that was like
and then there was one little town, very, very small, that had a woman mayor, a woman police chief. I mean, everything with a woman ahead of the different departments in the city. So it was run by women.
So she has more clout than she than she.
Right.
We've had a wonderful. It has been great. I don't know. There's all the difference in the world, and all of the internees. They finally realized. My first speech was in Denver, Colorado, and I had never made a speech to all these Japanese before. And so the first thing I did, I apologized. I said, I am so sorry that we did what we did to our citizens who are supposed to be our friends. And I said, I want to apologize and ask you to forgive us. And then I went ahead, was talking, and after the speech, well, everybody came up, wanted to visit. And as they were leaving, I saw this elderly gentleman and his granddaughter coming toward us. And as we got there, he was crying. And his granddaughter said, Mayor Gould, I want you to meet my grandfather. Says he has hated being Japanese He didn't want us to speak Japanese. He didn't want anything Japanese. He hated us because we looked like Japanese. And he says, and it's 40 years after we were out of the camps. And he said, you're the first person that ever said you're sorry, for what happened. And the man got my hand. He said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And so they left. And 3 or 4 weeks or so later, she called and said that her grandfather had just died. But she said he's been the happiest he has ever. Said he would dance around singing Japanese songs and want to speak, in Japanese, and said he'd hug us and apologize. And I mean, that happened quite so often. I have letters from people, not that I'm trying to make myself sound, it's just, all the Japanese Americans wanted was somebody to understand what they went through being citizens of this great nation that we are, and yet we treated them the way we did.
Mm-hmm. And Rosalie, it's so powerful to hear you talk about how you sort of took up stewardship of this site, and preserving this site and making it possible for people to return and see the places where they had been incarcerated or their families had been. It's powerful, I think, to go back to those places, and it means a lot, I think.
You see, you're looking at it wrong too. I'm the one that really benefited. See, that's what I can't make them understand. These years have been wonderful. They just don't understand. Until you really do talk to them about what they went through, and when they were moved away from California, they literally lost everything, even pets, houses. Nothing. What they could sell, well, they couldn't sell in that short 7 days that they had to get ready to leave their houses.
Right.
But heavens, I had no problems at all. I was having a ball at the University of Arkansas, and so I could feel sorry for a few people, that didn't have it as easy as I did during that time.
And you love having visitors. She's the most welcoming, hospitable person. I've slept in this house.
You're letting us live stream from your house.
No, I should have said that.
I was working with the Life Interrupted. She and Jessica, her cohort, they stayed in their pajamas working. So she didn't tell you that part. She said she stayed here.
We processed some of the collection in our pajamas. Yes, we did do that. We were 25.
No, at this point, we've all done work in our pajamas this year. I think it's very
yes. Would have sounded weirder a year ago.
Right. Now it's like, yeah, that's every day. Well, I do, man, I could ask so many more questions, but I do want to ask about the collection in particular. And Heather, we have a question from Frank Abe, who's tuning in. Hi, Frank. And he says, Heather, in the collection or in the Outpost newspaper, have you come across any short fiction or poetry? He's looking to include in a literature anthology. So this is a research question from Frank.
So, Frank, I will be perfectly honest. It has been a long time since I've looked at the Outpost. It was probably 15 years ago, the last time I really looked at the Outpost. But when I get back to Little Rock next week, I can ask our chief curator and archivist about that, and I can actually go and look myself. I think there are. I think there's and there's definitely some in the yearbooks. So in addition to, I did talk about the Outpost and the comic strip, because I think the comic strip is super cool. It is someone with a Japanese face and a coonskin hat. You can't really get more Arkansas than that. But there are, in addition to the Outpost newspapers, we also have stuff from Jerome, and we have yearbooks. So the archival collection is huge.
And those autobiographies, I wonder if that might be something also to be. Yeah. And I know some of those are digitized, right, on the website.
Some of them are digitized, yes. If you go to robertslibrary.org/rower, the autobiographies, it'll actually jump to the page for the Fayetteville site, which is where they've done, the School of Architecture has done this 3D spatial recognition, crazy technology stuff, and it's super cool. It's way beyond my ability. But they asked for digitized stuff, and so some of them are there, including, and I forgot to tell you guys this the other day, a list of the names of all the autobiographers. So that's on there as well. So yes, Frank, I will get you your contact information, or you can email me, and we will find you stuff.
That's great. Thanks, Heather. And thanks for that question, Frank. This is sort of skipping back a bit, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this collection came to be. Rosalie, how you ended up with the collection, and then how it's sort of evolved since being donated, if it's traveled, those kinds of things.
Well, I told you about the first night that I met them, they had promised me or told me they wanted me to have it. And I do want to stress that I did own the collection, but I gave it to the center in their names because it really belonged to them. It did not really belong to me. And I think that they're the ones that deserve the credit. Of course, they had to put my name on it. They couldn't put all of their names on it. But that's the way that started. And then at the 50th anniversary, that was the first time I had met Jamie. Just before then, I had talked to her, and I had gone to see her.
She lived in Memphis, right?
Yes, she and her sister lived in Memphis, two sisters. And so I called her and told her that we were having that 50th anniversary, and she was in bad health. So she said, well, she just didn't feel, she or sisters, either one didn't feel like driving. So I drove up to Memphis and picked them up and brought them home and took them up to the celebration, and then took them back. And she was telling me then about her collection, and she showed me her, instead of guest books like I have, that all the guests have signed. She had her bedroom door, and she had all of the visitors sign on her bedroom door their names.
Wow.
And then after she died, well, Crete, her sister, called me and told me that Jamie had left the collection to me in her will. And when I had time, would I come up, to get them? And I said, oh, please save that door. I want that door. Well, they had an auction to sell all of her stuff before I made it. And somehow or other, they didn't sell the door, but somebody threw it away. And I guess they saw all the names on it and just threw it away. So I came home with all of the collection, the documents and the autobiographies and the art and so forth. And then as different people would see, the collection was in my house for 3 or 4 years before I sent it to the center there, and people would come to see it, and they'd say, "Oh, I have so and so," and would ask David Strickland, who was director then, if they could, donate it. And of course, certainly we were very, very happy to, to have anyone that wanted to give anything. And the only stipulation I made with David was that if any of their descendants came back, that they would be allowed to actually pick up a piece and hold it and think about what, their ancestor went through with all of this. And of course, he was very gracious and said, of course. And of course, I appreciated that, because I thought that, it would be nice for them to say in 100 years from now to pick it up and think, gosh, just think what they went through to generate these things.
Right. And we still, we do that. That's one of the stipulations. And I always tell people, I've worked at a lot of museums, and normally you ask to see something and, oh, well, it's in the vault or whatever.
Right.
We do like to have a little bit of forewarning when people are coming. Ideally 2 weeks would be great, but that we've had, like 48 hours worth of notice, but you just let us know that you're coming and the name of your ancestors, and we'll see if we've got any pieces, but then we'll also pull pieces that people like, the most common things that people enjoy. So we do that on a regular basis. We have a small exhibition up on our second floor in our research room with some of the pieces from mainly of the art. But yeah, we really kind of roll out the red carpet for folks when they come.
They do a great job. They really do. We got compliments from the people who come, and
we don't take them to lunch.
That was a Rosalie special. It's wonderful. And
that's okay. You let me know. I'll plant another row of cotton.
Okay.
Oh man, Heather, is the library still accepting donations of artifacts? Do you know, or?
Yeah. So the collection's kind of had several phases. It's what Jamie saved from the camps initially. Then she also was sent things and given things by her students during her lifetime. Rosalie has continued to be given things. And then other people, Frank Sada, for example, gave us a number of items, and I think he has a book out now. Okay. Yes. And so
I have it somewhere.
yes, I totally forget to give a shout out to, I have to say hi to Richard and hi to Frank. So we continue to accept things. Yes.
Okay. That's good information for us to know and our audiences to know. Well, thank you both so much. It's really such a pleasure and an honor to talk with you and hear some of these stories, Rosalie and Heather. We are at the end of our time, but if there's any final word you'd like to put in.
Yes, I would like to tell all my friends that I have thoroughly enjoyed visiting with them these years, and I do appreciate them coming, and I appreciate all of the gifts that they had given me that showed that they did have trust in me, and I do appreciate it, and I appreciate you and the rest of the crew for having me visit with you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Heather, for being flexible with the technology and making this work. What a treat. Yeah.
And encourage people. Is everybody watching Relocation Arkansas?
Yes.
Part of this?
Yes.
So, that is Rosalie's daughter's film.
Yes.
So, and Richard Yada is in there, but I think it's a very good, the what happened after often doesn't get talked about. And I think it's a very powerful film. So
perfect. That's a perfect one.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you to your daughter also for making it. Well, thank you both so much, folks. Thank you for tuning in and for your questions. We have one more session today at 6 p.m. Eastern time, 3 p.m. Pacific. That's about not Camp Shelby. That's tomorrow, Cat Island with Sherry Yamashiro. So thank you so much, Rosalie and Heather. And thank you folks for joining us. Thanks, Kimiko backstage, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.